And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
The 1980s were a weird time to grow up as a kid. You were absolutely, completely convinced by people in power that some random man around the corner was basically going to throw marijuana at you. This idea was driven home by countless campaigns, including the infamous Just Say No campaign of Nancy Reagan, as well as an endless series of public service announcements. My personal favorite was DARE, a police-sponsored in-school effort designed to keep kids away from the scourge of marijuana, which, actually had the opposite effect, but whatever. Desperate to keep kids away from the devil's weed, government and media officials engaged in some rather unique methods. There were the PSAs involving eggs, Saturday morning specials, endorsements from celebrities, the President of the United States holding a bag of crack, and way, way, way more cartoons with characters doing illegal substances than there ever should have been. And then there was Wally Bear and the No Gang. These cartoon characters may not have been designed exclusively for video games, but that is absolutely where they wound up. And strangely enough, the game was a bit of a cult classic, helping to carry on a message designed for kids about staying sober in an age when drugs, alcohol, and tobacco were thought to be the biggest evil in the land. Even wilder is that the makers of the game, American Game Cartridges and American Video Entertainment, were making an unlicensed game. This meant that they did not have permission from Nintendo to use the system. In fact, American Game Cartridges had made some of the most violent unlicensed games for the Nintendo in its history, and yet they went ahead anyway, creating a platforming game that was meant to keep kids away from drugs. And believe it or not, the game was okay. At a bare minimum, it wasn't horrendous, and it was endorsed by very reputable government and nonprofit agencies. Here is the wild story of Wally Bear and the No Gang, the Nintendo game meant to keep kids off drugs. This really weird story starts in a few places. First, there's American Game Cartridges. AGC was a subsidiary of the company ShareData. ShareData was a small software house. Their games included quiz games and game shows for the Commodore 64. This included Family Feud, Wheel of Fortune, and Jeopardy! American Game Cartridges itself was founded in 1990 and run by Richard Frick. Frick had worked for Atari and had some experience with Tengen. You may remember Tengen as the company that, rather infamously, fought Nintendo on multiple fronts and figured out how to develop the Rabbit system that got around Nintendo's lockout chip. As such, Tengen was able to make multiple unlicensed games, although the courts eventually stepped in and forced them to stop doing so. Frick, familiar with the process of making unlicensed games, got to work on a project. With an active lawsuit flying between Tengen and Nintendo that revolved around the Rabbit system and its subsequent business practices, Frick likely thought the better of using that method of bypassing Nintendo's 10NES lockout system, which prohibited unlicensed games from playing on the Nintendo. Instead, he went a new route through a similarly situated company, Color Dreams. Color Dreams, which would become Wisdom Tree and made so-called Christian games, figured out a different way of getting around the 10NES lockout chip. They sent a small electrical charge into the chip, stunning it, and allowing unlicensed games to boot up. Even better is that fearing bad publicity, Nintendo never went after Wisdom Tree, because suing the company that made Christian games would have been not a great PR move. As a result, Frick licensed the technology from Color Dreams and set to work on creating unlicensed products from the Nintendo. As such, Frick immediately licensed two of the more violent video games ever made for the Nintendo. First, there's Chiller, which is basically torture porn. I'm serious. This game was made for shock value and allows you to torture people, turning their cartoon bodies into a gory mess. The game features the use of the light gun, the same used in Duck Hunt, in a way that the hunting dog would most certainly not approve of. And no, I'm not showing you some of the more gory scenes here because I want this video to be monetized. The other game, Death Race, is still violent, but certainly not as bad. This was actually one of the first ever violent video game controversies. We did a video of the arcade version months ago, and marked the first time that the game had been ported to a home console. In Death Race, your job is to control a car and basically run over as many people, I meant to say zombies, as you can. These two games were both licensed from Exidy, but the third game, Shockwave, was an original. Thankfully, Shockwave is a game that you could theoretically expect to be licensed by Nintendo. In this game, you play as an astronaut and have to collect crystals in a set time limit. The crystals have been left behind by an alien race. You also have to avoid fireballs, use a space laser, all that good stuff. None of these games were officially licensed by Nintendo. Chiller and Death Race were way too violent, meaning that they couldn't be sold in stores and had to be sold via alternative methods, including mail order and flea markets. That, naturally, created a real problem for AGC, which quickly found themselves in financial trouble. As a result of some of these restrictions, AGC went out of their way to keep costs down, unquestionably acknowledging that they had to keep their prices down to outsell the competition. AGC also went to some unique lengths to sell their games. For example, they offered a contest. If you were one of the first 100 people to beat Death Race and took a picture of yourself next to the game's end screen, you could win an official Death Race car, a remote-controlled car, that is. American Game Cartridges may have been the developer behind the video game of Wally Bear, but they didn't create Wally Bear themselves. That honor goes to Walter J. Marsh. Marsh, a resident of Fogelsville, Pennsylvania, founded the appropriately named company, Edutainment, in April 1990. He applied for a trademark of Wally Bear and the No Gang around September 1990. Wally Bear was one of several characters who were meant to give kids a lesson against the use of drugs, alcohol, and other harmful substances. This includes Billy Bunny, Priscilla Possum, Stevie Squirrel, Timmy Tiger, and Toby Turtle. Game development for Wally Bear and the No Gang was finished in 1991, but by then, AGC's financial problems caught up with them. The company had a growing debt challenge and entered Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1991. They had a game, but no resources to complete and publish it. Frick, who was responsible for AGC's Nintendo unit, had left in February 1990 to form American Video Entertainment. American Video Entertainment, like American Game Cartridges before it, was a subsidiary of a larger company, Macronix, and produced, you guessed it, unlicensed Nintendo games. American Video Entertainment bought the rights to Wally Bear and the No Gang, and the publication was back on. As for the game itself, it is a side-scrolling platformer. You play as Wally Bear. Wally's uncle, Gary Grizzly, maybe he's married to Aunt Alliteration? Anyway, Uncle Gary has planned a party for Wally and his friends. Wally's parents tell him to go invite his friends and get to his uncle's house before dark. They also warn him to stay away from drugs. I know my parents warned me to stay away from drugs whenever I left the house. The 90s were weird. Anyway, you skate through various stages that all of us suburban kids were familiar with, including pleasant streets, rundown industrial areas, and demon fortresses. There's a time limit and, of course, enemies to avoid. You can also pick up weapons, looks like a hat or something, I don't know, and use those to fend off bad guys. The end of each level features a cutscene with in-game text describing how the bad guys are trying to get Wally's friends to join their gang and presumably run around doing drugs and whatnot. Wally has to help his friends accomplish their various goals, like access the subway or recover a stolen radio. Levels then feature an anti-drug message and broader conversation about peer pressure. Cutely, the game also features in-game advertisements for other American Game Cartridges projects like Shockwave and Crossbow. I'm also pretty sure that Wally Bear is murdering human-like rats throughout his community. Seems like we should be discussing that more. At the end of the game, Wally Bear arrives at his uncle's house, joining his friends who are already there. Uncle Gary seems to acknowledge you, the player, in a fourth wall breaking speech, and the game concludes with, you guessed it, an anti-drug message. Because of the relatively late stage of development, the game was released in 1991 and developed in 1990 and 1991, the graphics are actually relatively sharp for Nintendo. There's even cutscenes. Despite its unlicensed status, a 1992 edition of GamePro reviewed the game and awarded it 5 out of 5 stars, and no, they were not on drugs when they gave its rating. So, here's what might be the most interesting thing about the game. Yes, it's your standard fare when it comes to development, but the game actually had some heavy hitters that were involved in the anti-drug messaging portion. The first was the American Medical Association, a professional organization representing doctors and medical students. The group, founded in 1847, is one of the oldest and most impactful voices when it comes to lobbying and medical care. The second agency was the National Clearinghouse for Alcohol and Drug Information, which bills itself as one of the leading repositories of information about drugs and alcohol in the country. This agency is deeply involved with distributing information about drugs, alcohol, and other substances. So yeah, you've got two really legitimate outside organizations involved in the creation and promotion of this wild, kind of surreal, side-scrolling platformer, working with an unlicensed developer on an unlicensed game, and the same company that made Nintendo-based torture porn. How tied in was Wally Bear and the No Gang with a formal anti-drug establishment? Well, the original name was Wally Bear and the Just Say No Team, a reference to Nancy Reagan's infamous anti-drug slogan, but that slogan was actually trademarked, so the developers had to look elsewhere, thus defaulting to the No Gang instead. The game manual has more than just instructions on how to play the game. In some cases, it also had instructions on how to work the game. At some point after the release of Wally Bear and the No Gang, it stopped working. As noted earlier, the game was designed to temporarily knock out the 10NES security system. However, Nintendo would periodically update the console itself, doing so to make it work better, manage new games, and defeat counterfeiters, a huge problem throughout the world, but especially in Asia. In October 1990, new Nintendo systems were made with the Revision 11 circuit boards. These revisions had resistors on two lines that would defeat the electric charge meant to defeat the lockout chip. Any system with the Revision 11 circuit boards wouldn't play any game that used this method. Wally Bear and the No Gang, everyone's favorite anti-droid platformer, was suddenly unplayable. Frick and AVE weren't going to take this lying down. Frick believed that Nintendo had revised the system to target them specifically, and wrote Howard Lincoln, senior vice president and general counsel of Nintendo, accusing him of such, saying that the update was meant specifically to put AVE out of business. Lincoln ignored the letter, but was quoted in the book Game Over as saying, "American Video Entertainment accused us of deliberately doing it to them. I didn't respond, but the answer is, we can make our product any way we want. The change was not to drive you out of business. We didn't even know you were in business before we got your letter." Subsequently, Frick and American Video Entertainment sued Nintendo for a whopping $105 million, accusing the company of using their business practices to violate antitrust laws. As correctly noted by Game Over, American Video Entertainment did prove something very real about Nintendo. A developer could lower prices for consumers if they didn't do business directly with Nintendo's licensing system. AVE was able to make a profit by selling games very cheap, as low as $20, and they could afford to do this because they didn't have to pay Nintendo's royalty or manufacturing fees. The legal battle continued. In 1992, Frick accused Nintendo of threatening retailers by saying that any retailer that sold games that used the Zapper technology employed by Wally Bear and other games would invalidate the warranty, a charge that Nintendo denied. AVE continued to rely on other outlets to sell its games. For example, Blockbuster bought more than 2,000 copies of Wally Bear, meaning that you very well might have rented the game from the video rental giant. Incidentally, Blockbuster also got into a legal fight with Nintendo, and you could see that video in the description below. The lawsuit would, ultimately, be settled in 1994. The terms were kept secret, and that is a damn shame. I would love to know how much American Video Entertainment got out of all this. Side note, amazing that I can't do a video on Nintendo without somehow mentioning a lawsuit. Back to the instruction manual, which threw no shortage of shade at Nintendo. There was, sadly for fans of Wally Bear, no easy way to play the game on newer systems. As such, the instruction manual laid out options for consumers: how to upgrade your Nintendo to play the game and earn a $10 credit for any AVE product, which was probably an absolutely horrendous idea. You could also pay American Video Entertainment $9.95, and they would find you a qualified technician who could make the repairs. Do so by calling the hotline number below, and again, terrible idea. The instructions also laid out how you could join the Wally Bear and the No Gang fan club. For $3.50, you could get additional Wally Bear swag, a bi-monthly newsletter, and even more Wally Bear content that you craved. Sadly, I couldn't find any information on sales numbers for Wally Bear and the No Gang, but the game has seen a more recent rise in popularity, infamy, whatever, as a result of many YouTubers far better known than me covering the game. This includes the Angry Video Game Nerd and JonTron. Unbelievably, there is also an official speedrun record for the game. The record is currently held by John's Nerd Rage, who beat the game in 6 minutes, 18 seconds, and .667 frames. He beat the previous holder, Darbian, by less than 2/10 of a frame. Darbian is actually a really famous speedrunner, holding the record for countless Nintendo games. Wally Bear and the No Gang did not end with the sales of the Nintendo game itself. Another character, Recycle Man, was introduced shortly after the publication of Wally Bear. This character, you may have figured this one out, encouraged kids to recycle. In 1994, Wally Bear and the No Gang was rebranded as Wally Bear and the No Gang and began to discuss additional social topics. A hotline was eventually set up that would allow kids to speak directly to Wally Bear. That number was 1-800-HI-WALLY. The hotline also gave kids anti-drug information. Wally Bear and the No Gang was retired in 2004, replaced with Building Blocks Friends, which continued with Wally Bear and an anti-drug effort. It also expanded into child-parent interactions and childhood development. The Building Blocks Friends was retired in 2015. Wally Bear is presumably now in Florida, telling everyone at the retirement village he was once the star of a video game. Including Wally Bear, American Video Entertainment would release about 19 games between 1990 and 1992, which is actually a really high number. These games included gambling games like blackjack and a 15-in-1 multi-cart game. Their last game, Q-Stick, pool game, was never released. The company would eventually declare bankruptcy. According to Frick, the remaining inventory was sold to discounters or scrap. I think this story perfectly epitomizes why Nintendo's history fascinates me so much. It is absolutely astounding that major medical players, including the American Medical Association and the United States government, would develop an unlicensed video game with the same company that made incredibly violent video games. However, I'll add this. Nintendo, as they would eventually admit, wasn't ready for the backlash that the company began to face in the late 80s and early 90s. Parents were deeply worried about the amount of time their kids were spending using the system. A more positive social agenda, like the one promoted by Wally Bear, may have helped to shield them from some of this criticism. However, Nintendo was Nintendo. Play by their rules or not at all. AVE tried to ignore their rules, and they didn't survive. As always, when we discuss rare games, I will ask you this important question. Did you play Wally Bear and the No Gang? What was your experience like? Do you have any Wally Bear merch? If so, let us know in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, please subscribe, or click on the next video that the almighty YouTube algorithm has served up for you. As always, have a wonderful day out there, friends, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I liked making it. Take care, everybody.